the early years of this century, the British Royal Navy introduced a revolutionary new type of battleship. They were known as dreadnoughts. Huge, turbine-powered, ironclad warships with the biggest guns ever to engage in battle on the high seas. They made the Royal Navy the masters of the world's oceans. At about the same time, Marconi had invented wireless telegraphy, or radio. So now aboard the new ships, there was a new duty, the wireless operator, who kept the ships of the fleet, steaming the distant seas, in constant touch with their commanders at the Admiralty, here in Whitehall, London. Within a few years, radio was adopted by all the world's major navies, particularly the US and the German high seas fleets. It meant that their warships could range far and wide across the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Indian Oceans, acting as powerful instruments of colonial power, always precisely controlled by their masters in Washington and Berlin and London. Prior to radio, it's worth recalling, the only way to send a message to or from a fleet at sea was to send it by ship, which might take several weeks. Radio transformed the role of fleets at sea. But there was a downside to the use of radio. It posed a grave threat to security. Anybody with a receiver, friend or foe, could pick up the secret signals and read their enemy's intentions.
Radio, or wireless telegraphy, when it came into being at the turn of the century, turned out to be a great boon for navies. It enabled operational headquarters to control ships far away at sea. But radio had an enormous disadvantage in comparison to this advantage. Namely, it turned over every message that it sent to the enemy. How were they to eliminate this leakage of information? They began to use codes and ciphers to protect them. But on the other side, the enemy, to gain access to this information, developed code breaking, and it became, in World War I, for the first time, an important instrument of war.
It was the beginning of the War of the Codebreakers that has gone on ever since. The German Navy signals were picked up in London in code as a meaningless jumble of letters and figures. It was a completely new problem for the Royal Navy. So they began to train a handful of men in this difficult trade. And then they had a huge stroke of luck. In the very early days of the war, the captain of a German warship made an elementary mistake, and it changed the course of the entire war. The cruiser Magdeburg was part of the German Baltic Fleet and was ordered to lay mines off a Latvian seaport and then, together with another warship and some fast torpedo boats, sail north to attack shipping, Russian shipping, in the Gulf of Finland. On the 23rd of August 1914, so just 2 weeks into the war, this little flotilla ran into dense sea mist just off the Russian coast. Now, the navigator on board the Magdeburg was very confident. He knew his position. He was mistaken. He was just 1 mile off course, but it was enough. In a flat, calm sea, enveloped in sea mist, steaming at 15 knots, the Magdeburg ran aground on the little Russian island of Oldensholm in the mouth of the Gulf of Finland. Its war had come to an untimely end. When the Russians arrived next morning, the Magdeburg lay high and dry. The captain and crew had made desperate attempts to scuttle the warship and destroy all secret documents. But very rapidly, Russian Navy divers recovered from the shallow waters around the ill-fated warship a priceless haul, no less than a copy of the principal codebook of the Imperial German Navy. The Russians passed this precious codebook to Britain, and it ended up in room 40 of the old Admiralty building in London. A small group of Navy intelligence officers had been set up by Winston Churchill at the outbreak of the war. And from this small beginning, room 40 was to become one of the most vital sources of intelligence in the devious history of codebreaking. Now, the Magdeburg codebook had no less than 34,000 groups made up of letters or figures, each of which represented key words or actions. So, for example, when the Group ODI was sent by radio, it meant action stations. When the Group GUK was sent, again by radio, it meant ram the enemy flagship. I doubt if that was used very often. But remarkably, despite the fate of the Magdeburg and the very real possibility that codes had been compromised, they remained unchanged. It meant essentially giving the British a dictionary to enable them to read secret German naval commands and orders. It meant that British intelligence often knew about German naval intentions at the same time as the German naval captains themselves. That was the case in May of 1916. It was the moment of truth, a turning point in the war. The codebreakers learned that the massive German high seas fleet, commanded by Admiral Reinhard Scheer, leading over 100 warships, was setting out to smash the stranglehold of the Royal Navy's dreadnoughts in the North Sea. That was a formidable task. The Royal Navy was by far the largest and most powerful navy in the world. It had been created on what was called the two-power principle. It had to be greater than any two foreign navies combined. Moreover, it was at the cutting edge of technology. It had made the transition from slow lumbering battleships to the fast turbine-powered dreadnoughts. The mighty fleet lay secure in deep and heavily protected anchorages along Britain's northeastern coast, and there was no doubt about its toughness. Life for naval crews was harsh in the extreme, and discipline was severe. In that respect, little had changed since Nelson's day. But morale was high right across the fleet. They were itching to get to grips with the enemy so close at hand, on the other side of the North Sea. However, there was one major question mark. The Royal Navy hadn't fought a major fleet battle since Nelson's distant triumph at Trafalgar. They could dance the hornpipe now, but might they dance a less jaunty step to the music of the German guns? Germany was being starved into submission by the blockade in the North Sea set up by the British Royal Navy. Now, the British Royal Navy had two main fleets, the Grand Fleet of mighty dreadnoughts, mainly here at Scapa Flow in the Orkneys, under the command of the somewhat introspective and withdrawn Admiral Jellicoe. Further south at Rosyth, on the Firth of Forth, there was the fleet of fast and deadly battle cruisers under the command of the charismatic Admiral Beatty. On the other side of the North Sea was the entire German high seas fleet at Wilhelmshaven on the Jade River under the command of Admiral Scheer. Now, the Germans intended to spring a trap. In simple terms, it was as follows. A fleet of fast battle cruisers would set to sea under Admiral Hipper as if to bombard British coastal towns. When Admiral Beatty came out with his battle fleet to respond, the trap would be sprung. The entire weight of the German high seas fleet, sailing just 50 miles astern, would be thrown against Admiral Beatty's battle cruisers to annihilate them. Now, the plan depended upon the fact that the British would know what was going on so late. It would be too late for the dreadnoughts under Admiral Jellicoe to take part in the action. And the destruction of Admiral Beatty's ships would cancel out the British advantage of numbers in the North Sea. When Jellicoe's dreadnoughts did get into the action, the German accurate gunners would wreak such heavy damage that Britain again would never be able to establish the blockade. Now, that was the plan. It was a good one. It had one flaw, and that was that the codebreakers in Room 40 knew about it within a matter of days of it being transmitted by radio to the German naval captains. On the 29th of May 1916, Room 40 was able to advise the Chief of War Staff, Vice Admiral Sir Henry Oliver, that the German high seas fleet was about to put to sea. Admirals Jellicoe and Beatty were advised that the German fleet would put to sea on the 31st of May. The British now had a huge opportunity to destroy the German fleet once and for all, because of the codebreakers' skill. it turned out to be an opportunity thrown away before even a shot was fired. The coded call sign of the German flagship was DK. However, when the flagship left harbour, the call sign DK was assigned to a shore-based radio station, and the battleship adopted a totally different secret call sign. All this was done in order to confuse the British eavesdroppers. But the British codebreakers were not deceived. They knew all about this ruse and used radio direction finding to listen to the German ships and track their actual movements. So on the 31st of May 1916, they knew that the mighty German High Seas Fleet had put to sea on a mission of destruction. However, there was a problem of human relations. The senior naval officers at the British Admiralty had a very low regard indeed, to put it no stronger, for the junior naval officers and the civilians even who fought their war in Room 40 with bits of paper and code books. So when on that fateful day in May 1916 a senior naval commander came to Room 40 to ask the key question, what is the location of call sign DK, he was given the technically correct answer, DK is still on the Jade River. Relations between the naval officers and the codebreakers were so bad that no other questions were asked, no other information was volunteered, to the effect, of course, that the ships themselves were now on the high seas and racing towards the British shore. In that single moment, the massive codebreaking advantage was thrown away, and what followed was a chapter of disasters and missed opportunities. Believing that the Germans were still in harbour, Admiral Jellicoe steamed his Grand Fleet from the Firth of Forth and Scapa Flow at economical speed to conserve fuel, as he awaited news of the German fleet setting sail, before speeding to link up with Admiral Beatty's heavy cruisers which had sailed from Rosyth. Meanwhile, Beatty was amazed to discover that afternoon that he'd steamed almost into the guns of the advance guard of the German battleships. Beatty turned north to draw the German fleet onto Jellicoe's guns. But in the next half hour, he lost 3 warships to excellent German gunnery. The Indefatigable, the Queen Mary, and the Invincible, when the magazine was hit, which blew the ship to pieces. She sank with all hands. This was the cause of Admiral Beatty's celebrated remark to his flag lieutenant, "There's something wrong with our bloody ships, Chatfield." As night fell, the frustrated British commanders searched for the elusive German fleet without success. Next day, the Germans escaped back to the safety of the River Jade. The Battle of Jutland, the first and the last engagement between these mighty dreadnought ships, was over. The Royal Navy lost 3 battle cruisers, 3 cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 6,274 officers and men. The German losses were lighter: 1 battleship, 1 cruiser, 4 light cruisers, 5 destroyers, and just 2,545 officers and men. It was a tactical defeat for the Royal Navy, but it was also a strategic victory. The High Seas Fleet never sailed from the River Jade again, except when it surrendered in 1918. The Battle of Jutland was an object lesson. Intelligence, however good, is only a means to an end, not an end in itself. If all the codebreakers' intercepts had been acted on promptly and relied on by the admirals at sea, the outcome could have been very different. Winston Churchill described Admiral Jellicoe as the only man on either side who could have lost the war in an afternoon. Without the codebreakers of Room 40, he could well have done so. When the British ships returned to harbour with their wounded, there was no triumphal welcome. The British public and the press demanded a scapegoat. It could only be Jellicoe. The quiet, grave little man had always held himself remote from press and publicity. Within 6 months of the battle, he was moved away from his beloved dreadnoughts to a desk at the Admiralty. His place was taken by the dashing Admiral Beatty, ironically the man who'd lost most men and most battleships in the brief skirmish, but also the man who, rightly or wrongly, had won the highest praise. But with the Battle of Jutland lost, the war slipped deeper into stalemate, with millions of men trapped in trenches facing each other across the battle-scarred mud of northern France. But once again, the codebreakers broke the stalemate with what has been called the most important intercept of the entire war. It came from an unusual source. One of the first acts carried out by the Royal Navy when war started was to locate the German underwater transatlantic telegraph cables, which were promptly lifted and cut. That immediately forced Germany to use radio for its transatlantic messages, which the British eavesdroppers in London could intercept. However, beneath the streets of Edwardian London, there were still the cables of neutral Sweden and America. Top secret German messages were sent on them. Although it broke all international conventions, the codebreakers tapped into these cables. On Wednesday, the 17th of January 1917, they struck pure gold. Blinker Hall, the British officer in charge of Room 40, described the event afterwards. "I'm not likely to forget that Wednesday morning. There was the usual docket of papers to be gone through on my arrival at the office. I was still working on them when at about 10:30 de Grey came in. He seemed excited. 'Sir, do you want to bring America into the war?' 'Yes, my boy,' I answered. 'Why?' 'I've got something here which might do the trick.' The something was a German diplomatic telegram sent by Germany's foreign minister in Berlin, Arthur Zimmermann, to the German ambassador Bernstorff in Washington. "Most secret, for your Excellency's personal information, and to be handed on to the Imperial Minister of Mexico by a safe route. We propose to begin on the 1st of February unrestricted submarine warfare. In doing so, however, we shall endeavour to keep America neutral. If we should not, we propose to Mexico an alliance upon the following basis: joint conduct of war, joint conclusion of peace, regain lost territory in Texas, New Mexico and Arizona. Your Excellency should for the present inform the President of Mexico secretly that we expect war with the USA. Our submarines expect to compel England to peace in a few months. Acknowledge, Zimmermann." The content of the cable was explosive. Germany was revealing that it was about to use the U-boats to sink any ship of any nation, including American ships, they intercepted on the high seas. Worse still, Germany was inviting Mexico into a war against still neutral America with a promise of huge territorial gains. The cable was dynamite. If handled properly and passed to President Wilson without revealing that British agents were tapping neutral Swedish and American, indeed anyone's cables they could get into, then the President would have little choice but to bring America into the war. The stalemate on the Western Front would be broken, and the British Allies were bound to sweep on to victory. The full text was passed to President Wilson early in 1917, with a cover story that it had been intercepted after it reached Mexico. In April 1917, President Wilson brought America into the war against Germany. The result was decisive. arrival of thousands of fresh American soldiers with unlimited supplies broke the stalemate on the Western Front and swept the Allies on to victory. In November 1918, although not a single inch of its territory had been occupied, Germany capitulated. It brought to an end what had been the most violent war in all of human history. The blunders of the politicians and the generals had led to the destruction of an entire generation of British, French, and German youth in the mud of northern France. The whole Western world went wild, rejoicing at the end of the war to end all wars. The codebreakers had proved to be the decisive secret weapon.
The Zimmermann telegram was the most important single code solution in history. It demonstrated an absolutely brilliant use of intelligence by Admiral Hall. Its importance, of course, was that it precipitated America into the Great War on the side of the Allies. And for the first time, intelligence had had a significant effect on the course of world events.
Not long after the end of hostilities, Winston Churchill, who had been First Lord of the Admiralty, revealed in his memoirs just how important a role the codebreakers of Room 40 had played. German commanders were stunned that their signals had been penetrated. Nowhere did that message strike home more forcefully than in the mind of a young U-boat commander, Karl Dönitz, who was to command the entire U-boat fleet in World War II. He had seen just how close the U-boats had come to breaking the naval blockade. He determined at that moment that never again would Germany's naval codes be broken. For the USA too, the exploits of Britain's Room 40 had proved their war-winning power. A young and brilliant American codebreaker named Herbert Yardley had been sent across to gain experience from the British. He returned to Washington to play a central role in America's top-secret code-breaking operations against the Japanese. But that's another story. The war to end all wars had run its course. Right across America and Europe, people poured out onto the streets in a spontaneous eruption of joy and delirium at the end of this terrible conflict. Peace would bring its own problems soon enough, but for a time the only concern was to bring the boys home, out of the hell and havoc of Northern Europe, to a hero's welcome, bands and parades and the arms of their loved ones. This demobilisation also applied to Whitehall, to the men of Room 40, who had fought their war with pen and paper behind closed doors. A few stayed on to form the nucleus of a future intelligence unit, but most returned to the dreaming spires of Oxford and Cambridge from which they'd been recruited. They were sworn to secrecy, never to talk about their wartime activities, or to reveal any part of their knowledge of the German codes. No one broke that oath. But rank hath privilege. The first Sea Lord, the highest-ranking British Admiral, Jackie Fisher, couldn't resist telling the secrets he knew of Room 40 in his book of memoirs published in 1920. Never one to be outdone, Winston Churchill, the ex-First Lord of the Admiralty, joined in with his bestseller, The World in Crisis, published in 1923. In it, he gave an embellished and colourful account of the capture of the German cruiser Magdeburg and the German naval codebooks in 1914. Churchill wrote a very dramatic account of the whole episode. He writes, "The body of a drowned under-officer was picked up by the Russians a few hours later. Clasped in his bosom by arms rigid in death were the cipher and signal books of the German Navy." Now, as a matter of fact, the code books, the copies of the code books captured by the Russians and now held by the Public Records Office in London show no signs of ever having been immersed in water. But leaving aside that poetic licence Churchill's revelations were a complete disaster. The German High Command fought the entire war convinced their codes were utterly secure. They had no idea the British code breakers, the men of Room 40, were reading their most secret signals. To learn that in the aftermath of an abject national surrender aroused a storm of anger amongst the entire German military hierarchy. They determined it would never happen again. They went on a quest for the unbreakable cipher system. The first clues to the success of their search were picked up in, of all places, Poland, a country that throughout European history has been constantly preyed on and overrun by its two powerful neighbours, Russia and Germany. Poland was a country with very limited manpower and outdated military equipment. Polish generals knew that if attacked, to have any chance at all, they would have to position their armed forces with speed and foresight. And for that to happen, they had to be able to predict their enemy's intentions. To that end, they had developed one of the finest code-breaking organisations in the whole of Europe. In 1920, for example, Polish army codebreakers had broken the Russian codes, and as a consequence, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, they were able to repel a Russian invasion. But the Russians were not the only enemy at the gates. The shadow of Germany's resurgent military power cast a gloom over the country. Codebreakers in 1920s Warsaw focused on the German military codes with great success. They were able to read much of the German army signals traffic on a daily basis, all the way through the decade following the end of the Great War. Then suddenly, on July the 15th, 1928, the German signals changed abruptly. It was as if a shutter had come down. The messages became unreadable. The Polish codebreakers tried everything they knew, but without success. They guessed the Germans had introduced what they'd long been fearing, namely a multi-layered system of ciphers produced entirely by a machine. Now, theoretically, that was unbreakable. To understand how it works, we have to know something about codes and ciphers. Military codebooks work in very much the same way as telephone directories. Thousands of ordinary words and phrases are replaced by groups of numbers or letters that in themselves are meaningless. You can only read the encoded message if you have the codebook to look up the groups, to find out what they represent. So every single unit of an army or air force has to have the codebook. The weakness with codes is if just one codebook falls into the hands of the enemy, they can immediately decode every message they intercept. Ciphers are totally different from codes and much, much harder to crack, because they work on the basis of replacing every single letter of every word with a substitute letter or figure. You replace the normal alphabet with what's called a cipher alphabet. Roman commanders like Julius Caesar, for example, often sent their reports to Rome in simple transposition ciphers, where the normal alphabet is displaced by, say, 5 letters, to create what is known as the cipher alphabet, in which the message is written. In the 30s, many army commands on manoeuvres used cipher alphabets based on so-called keywords, normally words that are easy to remember so they don't have to be written down. They can be changed every day or even more frequently by word of mouth, without a vulnerable piece of paper being sent out. So here, for example, the keyword is Achtung. The letter H is therefore represented in the cipher alphabet by the letter A. But if any of these simple ciphers were used for secret military commands, they would be broken in a matter of minutes by professional codebreakers. What the German High Command was looking for was an unbreakable system, a system that might create thousands or even millions of cipher alphabets, one laid on top of another, so that the codebreakers might never untangle its complexities. But even if they did, it would all be far too late to be of use. In the 1920s, a machine had been invented in Germany that could do just that. It was given the name Enigma, which means an unbreakable puzzle. There had never been anything like it before in the realm of codes and ciphers. The power of the Enigma machine lay in the maze of electrical wiring inside the rotor wheels. The rotors were made of discs of insulating material with a ring of 26 contacts around the rim. Each letter was wired through to a different letter on the other side, and the 3 rotors were each wired completely differently. They were also geared in such a way that when one rotor had moved through 26 positions, The next wheel was nudged forward one letter. But it didn't end there. An end disk reflected the electrical signal back through the rotor wheels in a totally different alphabetical pathway. Then on the front of the machine they added a plug board to further complicate the circuitry. These devices multiplied the potential cipher alphabets available to several millions. So when the operator pressed the letter A on the keyboard, an electrical current flowed through the complex maze of wiring in the plug board and the rotor wheels to light up the code letter on the illuminated panel. At the battlefront, the operator removed the rotor wheels and shuffled them several times a day, initially from a group of 5, later on from no less than 8 wheels. So Enigma's great strength was that even if a machine were captured by the enemy, it was virtually useless unless they knew precisely which rotors were being used, in which order, and at what settings.
This is an actual German Enigma cipher machine. The keyboard, which was used to put in the letters, and an illuminable panel here, which the output letters would show up on as you enciphered the message. And of course, I must make clear that if I'm putting a message into code using an Enigma machine, the person who's receiving this message must have an identical Enigma machine, identically set up to take the message out of code. To put a message into Enigma cipher, the Enigma operator first had to choose 3 code wheels from the 8 later on that were available, put these wheels on their shaft in a particular order, then put the wheels into the machine, add these so-called plugs to a particular position, also prearranged, close the cover, and then begin, sometimes after some additional complications, begin enciphering by pressing letters of the message on the keyboard.
The Polish codebreakers were at their wits' end. By a remarkable series of cloak and dagger operations, they managed to obtain early versions of the Enigma machine, so at least they understood the principles on which it worked. But that didn't help them to break the messages produced on a daily basis by the German army because they didn't know how the machine was set up. Now, to tackle that problem, they set out on a seemingly impossible journey, namely to create a mathematical model of the entire Enigma machine. They recruited a brilliant group of 3 young German-speaking mathematicians from Poznan University. Jerzy Rosiecki, who was noted for his remarkable flashes of inspiration, and Henryk Cygalski and Marian Rajoyski, both extremely gifted analysts. These men were the pioneers in a battle to solve the puzzle of Enigma that would go on for the next 15 years and involve some of the finest brains in the world. The Polish trio began the fearsome task of constructing a mathematical model of the military Enigma rotor wiring. By 1931, the Poles had made some progress, but then there was an offer of help from the least expected source, from Germany itself. The offer came via this man, Captain Gustave Bertrand, of the French Service Renseignement, or military intelligence. In 1932, a German had walked into his office offering to sell his services as a spy. Now, Bertrand knew only too well that in the long history of espionage there were remarkably few walk-ins, as they were called, and they seemed to come in 2 categories, either those wanting to exploit their position for money, or, far more dangerously, those intent upon working as double agents, spies working for both sides. He had to know as soon as possible which category this man fitted into. This is the man Bertrand saw. He gave himself the gloomy codename of Asher, or Ashes, and very quickly he made his intentions clear. Asher told Bertrand he had access to highly classified documents, which he wished to trade for cash. There followed a series of meetings in several cities throughout Europe. The material Asher supplied was high grade, but on a certain date in 1932, he produced one of the highest classified documents ever traded in the entire history of espionage, nothing less than the complete instruction manual for the field operation of the German Army Enigma machine. Asher was paid the princely sum of 10,000 German marks, about $1 million at today's values, for this priceless document. Now, French intelligence had been working very closely with the Poles on this crucial problem of Enigma. At that time, British codebreakers didn't work with anyone on these matters, perhaps because they regarded themselves already as being the best codebreakers in the world. but they paid very dearly for their pride. A copy of this priceless German manual was sent immediately to Warsaw in the diplomatic bag. British codebreakers did not receive a copy. With the aid of the manuals which Usher had provided, the Poles were able at last to make progress. They began to crack some Enigma encrypted messages. They even created a truly revolutionary machine, a sort of primitive counting machine that was able to spin through the possible key positions of the Enigma rotors in hours, instead of the days and weeks it would have taken Polish codebreakers to do it manually. But time was running out. Hitler was impatient. The Germans entered the Sudetenland, part of Czechoslovakia, on the pretext of a request from its German-speaking population. No one called Hitler's bluff. The Germans had already occupied Austria, with scarcely a shot being fired. Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, flew to Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden in the German Alps in a desperate attempt to craft a peace, even a phony peace. The world held its breath. Was Europe to be plunged into war for the second time in a generation?
I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine.
The message of peace in our time was as frail as the paper it was written on. The summer of 1938, German troops exercised on the Polish frontier. Hitler demanded the return of lost German territory in Poland. Even at this 11th hour, the hope was that Hitler was playing at brinkmanship, that his bluff could be called. The brilliant Polish codebreakers sweated for every last scrap of information that would reveal his true intentions. Then suddenly, on the 15th of December 1938, their world went black again. They could no longer read the torrent of Enigma messages sent to German troops on their very borders. The Germans had simply exploited the fiendish power of the Enigma machine. They'd added 2 more rotors. So now operators in the field could choose at random any 3 rotor wheels from this package of 5. This was an immense increase in complexity, and it was also the end of the road for the Polish codebreakers. They just had time to pass on their knowledge and their methods to French and British intelligence before the lightning struck. It was blitzkrieg or lightning war, a wholly new form of warfare, more violent than anything the world had ever seen. planes and tanks and motorised infantry falling upon the enemy in a series of irresistible hammer blows, sweeping all before them, giving no time for the opposing forces to regroup or gather their senses. They were simply wiped out or swept aside. At its heart lay the power of Enigma. The bombers, tanks and infantry units were all closely coordinated by a constant flow of messages and position reports, wrapped in the secret Enigma ciphers. The enemy was blind and had no knowledge of where the next blow would fall. Poland fell in 2 weeks. Then the Low Countries in a matter of days. Then France. Across the land, where their fathers had lain mired in mud for years on end, the German tanks now raced at breakneck speed, sweeping all before them. In just 6 weeks, the German armies had reached the Channel coast at Dunkirk and virtually destroyed the entire French army and the British Expeditionary Force. It was a devastating display of military power, coordinated by a seemingly impenetrable cipher system. It seemed invincible, unstoppable. To rub salt into the wounds, Hitler received the surrender of France in exactly the same railway carriage as Germany had surrendered at Versailles in 1918. He now ruled Europe from the Atlantic coast to the Urals. Britain stood alone, the remnant of its forces that had escaped the German onslaught demoralised and disarmed. As the Battle for Britain drew near, Winston Churchill marshalled some of the most gifted British linguists and mathematicians at a secret country house outside London. For the embattled island to survive, they had to break the enigma. The Battle of France was over. The Battle of Enigma had begun. A battle the codebreakers had to win.